Peace, grace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. Amen. Wrestling with ourselves is common in our lives. In large ways, as we wrestle with our faith and our understanding of ourselves, but we also wrestle with ourselves in small ways, probably on a daily basis. For me, when I go to the grocery store, I spend at least 10 minutes in the ice cream aisle trying to pick out an ice cream flavor. Will I leave with a rich chocolate or a cookies and cream? Maybe I'll satisfy my love for coffee and get a Java or a mocha flavored ice cream. I can also go with my favorite fruit. Peaches has a flavor of ice cream. Or I can satisfy my ultra sweet tooth and go with my favorite candy, cotton candy ice cream. Then I have to choose a brand and weigh quality with cost. Am I going to splurge on $7 worth of fancy ice cream that will last me one night? Or will I buy half a gallon of store brand ice cream to last me at least a week? Me spending 10 minutes in the ice cream aisle, discovering what will satisfy my sweet tooth, is a minuscule example of wrestling. As we as people wrestle with parenting, faith, family, and ourselves. And in our Genesis lesson today, we see that we are not alone in our wrestling, as Jacob does not simply fight with himself in determining what ice cream he is going to buy. Rather, Jacob wrestles with God. If you think you come from a dysfunctional family, Jacob's family in our Genesis lesson probably has your family beat. Jacob took his brother's birthright by exploiting his brother's starvation during a famine by offering soup for his brother's birthright. Then, with the help of his mother, Jacob also stole his brother's blessing as the firstborn son by exploiting his father's blindness. By doing those things, Jacob took his brother's inheritance and status as the firstborn. In response, Esau, Jacob's brother, wanted to kill Esau, and Jacob fled for his safety. That sets the stage for our Genesis lesson in the 32nd chapter. In the 32nd chapter, 14 years has passed by, and Jacob, after being away from the land of Canaan, wants to return. However, Jacob is afraid of his brother's retaliation. He sends gifts ahead of him for his brother Esau, hoping that they will warm his heart. And the knowledge that Jacob will cross paths with Esau, he is uneased. He does not know that he will meet Esau as his brother or Esau as someone to fear. In his uneasement, he sends his wife and children ahead of him, leaving him alone. Then a man, unidentifiable, wrestles with Jacob until daybreak. However, the wrestling is concluded with Jacob saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." Jacob believes by the end of the Genesis lesson that he has wrestled with God. Many of us can identify with Jacob in this story, for we have wrestled with God. We have wrestled with God when it comes to how we raise children. We wrestle with God in determining what it means to live in a Christ-centered relationship. We struggle with God when we find ourselves in unhealthy and unhappy marriages and bring divorce into the conversation. We wrangle with God when we pay attention to the unflattering aspects of ourselves and we bitterly say, "Why am I like this?" Or when we are troubled by the reality of our world and we ask, "Why is the world like X, Y, and Z?" And when we wrestle with God, We usually do not think of ourselves as being engaged with God. Rather, we feel indecisive or inadequate. We think to ourselves that we should have it all figured out, and if we are wrangling with God, then we are not fully aligned with God. We're not on the same page with God. And we blame finding with God entirely on ourselves. Yet, in our Old Testament lesson, the table is completely reversed. In our Old Testament lesson, Jacob is not simply walking to the land of Canaan and then suddenly stop so that he may initiate a fight with God. Rather, in our lesson, Jacob is simply minding his own business. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, God chooses to initiate a fight. And Jacob does not simply let God win, nor does Jacob walk away. Rather, God has to strike Jacob on his hip socket in order to break away before sunrise, because God does not want Jacob to see God fully. I think our doubting selves, ourselves that look down on us for being indecisive, ourselves that see wrestling with God not as engagement, but as lack of alignment, would see Jacob wrestling with God as minimally pure behavior on Jacob's part. Yet, God does not condemn Jacob for wrestling with God. Rather, because of wrestling with God, Jacob receives a blessing and is given a new name, Israel. Jacob, in refusing to let go of God, says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And in return, God says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." Israel is the name of God's people. The word Israel defines what it means to be in relationship with God. And then the word Israel means wrestling with God. Through the naming of Jacob, God does not define what it means to be God's people with perfectly aligned with God or a perfectly obedient child. Rather, God chooses to use the word wrestling because God chooses to wrestle with us. And wrestling with God is being in a relationship with God. In our Old Testament lesson, wrestling with God is met with a blessing. It is grace. It is how God identifies God's self. After Jacob is named Israel for the wrestling with God, Jacob asks God for God's name so he may know who God is. God does not answer with a name that describes God as Israel describes Jacob. Rather, God answers Jacob's question by blessing Jacob. Who is God? God is a God of blessing. In moments of struggling with God, we have a God of blessings. God does not look down on us for struggling with God, for not always having our stuff together. We have a God who calls us to wrestle with God, to bring our doubts and questions, and in return, not to receive condemnation for lack of faith or disalignment, but to receive a blessing. What does this look like? What does it look like for wrestling with God to be blessed by God and our world? Blessed are those who have found themselves in an unhappy marriage and are considering divorce, for they are wrestling with God. Blessed are parents of LGBTQ children and are now unsure of their own personal beliefs regarding sexuality and gender identity, for they are wrestling with God. Blessed are those in hospital beds and are unsure of meaning in their suffering, for they are wrestling with God. Blessed are those who have relapsed in recovery due to drug and alcohol addiction, for they are wrestling with God. Blessed are those who see themselves in a new light and are unsure of what to make of themselves, for they are wrestling with God. Blessed are those whose faith convictions have taken a sharp turn, for they are wrestling with God. Being Israel, the name of God's people, which means to wrestle with God, means to be in conversation with God. Conversation with God is not always polite. Sometimes it is being mad at God. Sometimes it is kicking and stomping your feet. It is admitting, I do not know. And in return, God calls you God's people and gives you a blessing, just as God blessed Jacob. Bring your doubts. Bring your protest. Bring your unanswered questions to God, and know that God looks with favor. Amen.